What's up guys, it's me Jeremy. While it's maybe a little bit difficult to say what the most iconic deck in Hearthstone history is, it's definitely not hard to make a list of a few decks that come to mind, and one of the decks that would definitely be on that list has to be Mage. Although it's maybe receded a little tiny bit with Mad Scientist rotating out of Standard, Mage is a deck that's been around since the alpha of Hearthstone pretty much, I guess the beta really, and has survived all the way up until present time and has pretty much always remained relevant in the meta. It's a deck almost every Hearthstone player has played against at least some time in some capacity, even if you're maybe a more casual player, and even people who play other card games probably have heard about Mage in Hearthstone. So while it might not necessarily be the most absolute top tier deck right now, there was a point that it was just insanely busted and got nerfed into the ground, and it's still pretty good too. So let's talk about how OP Mage used to be. Mage was definitely the most dominant, or in its most dominant form during the beta of Hearthstone, as that is pretty much before the main nerfs that actually took place to the deck. You know, a lot of you guys probably know that Mage versus Control Warrior is probably one of the most one-sided matchups in Hearthstone, at least right now, and the fact that Mage has such a horrible matchup versus Control Warrior is typically what's been keeping it from being that tier 1 or perhaps even a tier 0 deck, but it didn't always used to be that way. In some of the earliest versions of the beta, alexstrasza was essentially kind of the same card it is today, except for one small difference. Instead of setting your opponent's health to 15, it set their entire HP pool to 15, which means it considered armor as health. This means that alexstrasza at the time would always reduce the opponent to a total of 15 health regardless of their armor. You know, for example, if the opponent had 15 health and 30 armor, they would get set to 15 health. If the opponent had 10 health and 40 armor, alexstrasza would set them down to 10 health and 5 armor. And this was, of course, you know, just insanely overpowered. I mean, it meant that Mage essentially had a good matchup against Control Warrior, and alexstrasza was just such a ridiculous card at the time. You know, you can kind of just sit there, collect burn in your hand, they can get as much armor as they want, and then you just alexstrasza them and kill them on the next turn, turning the deck's absolutely worst matchup into pretty much actually a really good one, if not one of their best matchups. Would bump pretty much any deck up a few rungs on the tier list, and with all the other tools Mage had at the time, the way alexstrasza used to work made the deck absolutely bonkers. It's not like this affected Control Warriors either actually, because Druids and Mages can also gain armor, and through some shenanigans other classes maybe could as well. That way Alex used to work was just completely busted, and it's a great thing that Blizzard fixed it, but Mages laughing at their opponent's 70 armor is something we'd personally rather not see again. But honestly, that wasn't just it. alexstrasza is probably the most notable thing back in the day, but they had a ton of other overpowered tools prior to some of the beta nerfs. So Blizzard, Cone of Cold, and Frost Nova each used to cost 1 less mana than they do today, which meant that Blizzard used to cost 5 mana, Cone of Cold used to cost 3 mana, and Frost Nova just a measly 2 mana. Now 1 mana on all these cards might not necessarily seem like a huge deal, especially since Mages nowadays today don't even really have that much room to play Cone of Cold anymore, but back then those changes were completely insane. You know, 1 mana off of all of your stall techniques and major spells, and board wipes honestly if you count Blizzard, meant that you had 1 additional mana each turn that you could dedicate to drawing cards, using burn spells, perhaps using your hero power to slowly whittle down your opponent, play your ice blocks, or just whatever else you needed to do. Mage is definitely a combo deck, and it definitely plays a lot of card draw, meaning that it can take really good advantage of mana cost reductions, since it will pretty much always have a lot of cards in hand that will be able to put that mana to use. Additionally, these cards costing less mana meant that you could save yourself from a lot of aggro deck scenarios that you wouldn't necessarily be able to today. You know, imagine being able to Frost Nova and Doomsayer on turn 4 against really aggressive decks is an extremely powerful tool and definitely helped the deck's matchups a ton. Additionally, there are a lot of games that Mage loses to something like Face Hunter or maybe Zoo on turn 5 because it can't cast its Blizzard until the following turn. Well, back in the beta this just never happened since your Blizzard cost 5 mana rather than 6, and aggro decks were also a little bit less prevalent, and as well that meant that you just lost a smaller percentage of your games to those turn 5 giant board states compared to how you do now. These spells costing less mana also meant that you could use Cone of Cold together with Archmage Antonidas on turn 10, and another with Frost Nova on turn 9 even. Now this might not necessarily be a huge bonus, but it did come out to fairly decent relevancy and gave people some much stronger Antonidas turns. Now this might not have been a huge bonus, but it definitely did come to play a decent amount, and it gave people a lot stronger Antonidas turns in general. You know, all those things put together meant that all these spells costing 1 less mana was a huge benefit for the deck, and along with the broken alexstrasza and how good Freeze Mage still is today, even after all of these nerfs, well, you can definitely start to see why the deck was so insane back in the golden days. But that's the thing, we're not done yet. Now there's one more pretty significant nerf that happened during the beta of Hearthstone, and that was the nerf to pyroblast. So back in the day, in the beta of Hearthstone, pyroblast used to only cost 8 mana. Now 2 mana is a massive cost reduction, and it also meant that now you could do things like pyroblast and frostbolt, pyroblast and frost nova on the same turn, or even just pyroblast and hero power. It also meant that you could cast your pyroblasts as early as turn 8 and just start burning out your opponents super early in the game. 2 mana is a huge improvement over the 10 mana it costs today, and it allowed most Freeze Mage lists to run 2 copies of Pyroblast. Not even Freeze Mage decks. Pretty much every Mage deck was playing 2 copies of Pyroblast at the time. And when you put together the alexstrasza that just laughs at armor, freeze spells that cost less, and that massive burn tool for just 8 mana, well, you're left with a really insanely broken deck, and one that was both very popular and definitely one of the best decks in the beta, at least before the nerfs, potentially one of the strongest decks in Hearthstone history. And calling something one of the best decks in beta as well is definitely not something to be taken lightly. I mean, during the beta, we had things like the full power Miracle Rogue, charging Molten Giant OTK decks, Buzzard Unleash Hunter OTK, and many, many more completely ridiculous decks that we might take a look at in future videos. The additional fact that a lot less counterplay existed as well, you know, cards like Eater of Secrets, Kazan Mystic, Lotheb, a lot of those cards just didn't exist, and a lot of those early beta decks were focused on just building up a board, which meant that the Freeze Mage deck could just roam free and completely terrorize the meta. At the time, even after the nerfs, it still remained top tier. Pre-nerf Freeze Mage was probably one of the best decks in Hearthstone history, and it would honestly be pretty cool if we could maybe get like a Tavern Brawl or something that would let us play all of those, you know, pre-nerf decks against each other with everyone's current level of game knowledge today and see what really was the best deck back in the old days. Still though, it's definitely safe to say that Freeze Mage would be at the top of the list. It just had so many crazy tools back in the beta, and it just used to be super OP. So those are some of the cards Freeze Mage had access to back in the good old days. A blast from the past. Hope you guys enjoyed. Definitely let us know what you think about Freeze Mage in the comments below. Either way, looks like that's going to be it for me. If you guys enjoyed the video, drop a like, subscribe if you want. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.